Video you ever have to watch on HMB. I'm going to try to break it all down. Okay, we're going to talk about safety, we're going to talk about efficacy, we're going to talk about dosing, we're going to talk about everything to see if it's really something that's worthwhile or worth your money. So this is the complete guide to HMB. Let me first say that I in no way, shape, or form am condoning HMB. I don't work with any HMB companies whatsoever. I don't even really take the stuff. I just understand the data, and I wanted to be able to articulate it in a way because it is so popular and not everyone knows how to read a research paper. So let's break it all down. What is HMB first? So HMB stands for beta hydroxy beta methylbutyrate. Okay? It is a byproduct of breaking down leucine. Leucine is the primary amino acid that is associated with building muscle. Okay, muscle recovery. When we consume protein, we break the proteins down, we deaminate them, and leucine is the one amino acid that is really responsible for triggering the anabolic response. It's the most anabolic amino acid that there is. Okay. Now, since HMB is sort of a downstream, like sort of metabolite, it's like a broken down component of leucine, the argument is, okay, I'm essentially getting a highly concentrated component of leucine that could trigger more muscle growth and potentially more strength and possibly even more fat loss if we look at enough data. Makes some sense, right? Okay, if you look at gram for gram, to get a 3-gram serving of HMB, you would have to consume 600 grams of protein, which would get you about 60 grams of leucine, which would equate to about 3 grams of HMB. So very, in essence, like people are looking at it as like a concentrated, super finite concentrated form of protein that is having a direct effect on muscle tissue. Now, leucine goes through a number of different conversion enzymatic processes, right? Okay, we have ketoisocaproate oxygenase, which breaks it down a little bit more into KIC, and then that gets broken down into HMB and some other compounds, most of which are excreted, and you're only left with a small amount of HMB, which hence why you have such a concentrated amount, right? You don't get much out of your protein, but you don't seem to need much to do the job. So now that we know roughly what it is and why people take it, let's move into the two different common forms. Okay, there is HMB calcium, HMB-CA, which you'll see, and there's also HMB-FA, free acid form. Now, they're both fine, okay, and the calcium form, like when you ingest it, it's going to get disassociated in the gut and it's going to absorb relatively quick in like 10 to 15 minutes. It's going to be in your system anyway. But most of the data is suggesting that a free acid form could have between 91 and 97% more availability. So it's going to absorb that much better. But at the end of the day, they're both pretty darn good. You're just getting better utilization, possibly out of a free acid form. Okay, a big one, safety. Is it something that's safe to take? Is it safe to take in relatively high amounts, right? Well, there's a study that was published in the journal Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise. It looked at just this. It gave subjects 6 grams, which is a pretty hefty amount, and it monitored them for a month. They found at the end of that month, there were no changes in any of their biomarkers. Their cholesterol levels were fine, their lipid levels, everything was fine, okay? They didn't change anything, almost no change whatsoever, which indicates that it's pretty safe. And if you look at the meta-analysis that look at a lot of the cohort studies, look a lot at the various performance studies and everything like that, and try to extrapolate data to make sure it's safe, they find the same thing. No real safety concerns with HMB. There is one thing to be cognizant of though, and that's kind of the insulin response that may occur from it. The European Journal of Applied Physiology found that in rodents, if they gave them 320 milligrams of HMB per kilogram of body weight, which is a pretty hefty amount, they did have a pretty significant increase in their fasting insulin levels. Okay, this could imply that taking in HMB might have an effect on insulin sensitivity. Now, what does this mean? Insulin sensitivity is very important for muscle growth and for fat loss. Okay, it's also important just for general health, but being sensitive to insulin means that when you consume protein, when you consume carbohydrates, your body knows what to do with it and reacts to it quickly. Okay, so it's able to take what it needs and do its job with it. If you are resistant, you're not absorbing those nutrients as well. Here's the caveat though. Leucine by itself, its very nature, is insulinogenic. So leucine is going to trigger an insulin spike, possibly even more than HMB, but we don't know because the data is kind of conflicting. Protein, if you go and you eat a steak, you're going to have an insulin spike. Okay, it doesn't mean it's the end of the world, so I'm not surprised to see that, and you're probably not going to be taking in that kind of dose, especially if you're taking this in lieu of protein, right? Okay, and some of the data that I'm going to talk about combines HMB with whey protein, so we'll get into that in just a second because protein clearly matters. That's why we're focusing on this. And today's video sponsor, just for the record, is ButcherBox, which if you are interested in getting grass-fed, grass-finished meat, good quality protein delivered to your doorstep, might be something to check out. As someone that really lifts a lot of weights and tries to get my protein in, it makes sense for me. And they have good quality meat, plus it's ultra convenient. Don't have to go to the grocery store, so it saves me a bunch of time and money. Plus, it's just awesome because the selection is amazing. Wild-caught salmon. I get all kinds of different cuts of beef. I get ribeyes, I get sirloins, I get fillets, I get whatever I want, really. Okay, and then obviously chicken, whole chicken, chicken thigh, chicken, you name it. The selection is awesome. Plus their bacon is amazing. So there is a link down below where you can check out ButcherBox, give them a try, get that beef, get that meat delivered right to your doorstep. It is awesome. So that link is down below in the description. And thank you to ButcherBox for allowing me to create awesome content and keeping this channel thriving. So that link's down below in the description. Now let's get to the meat of this. Body composition, strength. What kind of effect does it have? Okay, so there's an image that's popping up on the screen right now. If you look at this table, this is from the journal Nutrition, okay? This is cool because it gave subjects typical kind of HMB. They went through a routine with it. Now this was a 4-week routine, so if you're looking at the table, you can see that HMB supplementation, which is highlighted there, ended up resulting in more strength, ended up resulting in more muscle, and reduced fat levels, so less fat mass. When you look at that, it's pretty hard to say, like, I don't want to take this stuff. Like, I would want to jump. I see that data and I want to jump into it, right? That's pretty, but when you're comparing it to placebo or comparing it to a control, you have to take a lot of things into consideration. So let's look at more data. HMB is just a metabolite of breaking down leucine. Okay, so let's look at a study that compares HMB to leucine, because that's the first thing that popped in my head before even reading into the research. Knowing what it is, I'm like, well, can leucine do the same thing? So this study took a look at 1.5 grams of HMB combined with whey protein, okay, or 1.5 grams of leucine combined with whey protein. Now, there's a lot of evidence in other studies that show that when you combine essential amino acids, such as leucine, to protein, you can up to 4x the bioavailability of protein. It does help the absorption and the utilization of protein. So this study took a look at all kinds of lifting, all kinds of things. And at the end of the day, there was no change across the board. No change in strength, no change in muscle, no change in fat loss. Leucine, essentially, when combined with whey protein, seemed to have the same effect as HMB for a lot less money, because leucine's pretty darn cheap. And this study was a good 12-week study with very structured resistance training protocols. Phase 1, they did standard sort of 3 times per week periodization. Then phase 2, they went into an overreaching phase where they trained for 5 times per week. You need to have that volume increase, okay? You need to have that periodization where you have overreaching or even a little bit of overtraining to stimulate muscle growth. And then the third phase was a deloading phase back to 3 times per week. So the study design was good as far as resistance training was concerned. So really gets me wondering, well, why wouldn't I just take leucine? So let's look at more data. And this is where it gets a little controversial because there's people that really say the results are so amazing with HMB. Are some of these studies like pulling some shenanigans, or what's going on? Well, the European Journal of Applied Physiology published a paper taking a look at, again, a 12-week study in this case. And if you look at the table that's on the screen again right now, you're going to see, hey, once again, across all lifts like deadlift, squat, bench press, significant improvements in the strength levels with HMB. Same kind of thing with muscle mass, same kind of thing with fat loss. It's the same thing over again. So this is one of the studies that's come into question because you're looking at, in this case, resistance-trained athletes. And when you're looking at already resistance-trained athletes, it's hard to get data from them because, first of all, their results are going to be across the board because they have different adaptations. That's why a lot of times you see studies looking at beginners, because with beginners, you know that if they start working out, they're going to all have a very similar response in terms of muscle trauma and everything like that. So a lot of BS has been called on these studies. They're saying like, okay, well, what else is going on? You can't look at this data. Are they supplementing with other things? We'll talk about that in a second. But there's two things that I paid attention to. One thing was the creatine kinase levels. Creatine kinase is something that is increased when you have muscle trauma. If I were to go and I were to lift a car right now and beat the heck out of my muscles and get really sore, I would probably have elevated levels of creatine kinase, indicating that I broke down a lot of muscle tissue and beating my body up. When you take a beginner and you put them in the gym, it doesn't take much for those creatine kinase levels to get elevated. For me, as a trained resistance athlete, to get the same levels of creatine kinase as someone that's never lifted before, I would have to lift pretty heavy. I'd have to push it pretty hard, right? Like a beginner it's a lot easier for them to get sore and beat themselves up than it is for me, right? Well, the creatine kinase levels were matched in these studies that are under question, right? Showing that people that were resistance trained were pushing it really, really, really hard, okay, to end up getting the same result that a beginner would get. And so again, they're pushing it hard, so their results were good. Okay, they were taking HMB and that supported that. Again, we don't know if leucine would have done the same thing. Now, there was an interesting study that was done, and it was actually literally called Better Than Steroids, ? Because it was questioning how some of these HMB studies ended up suggesting that HMB could be stronger than some anabolics. Now, they're not saying that specifically, but when you put the data next to each other, you're like, okay, 600 milligrams of testosterone per week isn't getting as good of a result as taking in a few grams of HMB. I'm calling BS on that. And I can kind of see that, right? It's questionable. But again, these are shorter term results, so we don't know the full situation. Once again, exercise volume and exercise intensity would speak volumes here, no pun intended. Like we need to know, how can you say someone is training XYZ intensity? It's very difficult. And Ryan Lowery, who is the author of one of the papers that was in question, I know him quite well, actually know him very well. And I mean, for what it's worth, I know he's an ethical person. And one of the papers that came into question that he had written was about HMB in conjunction with ATP. Okay, 400 milligrams of ATP. We all know that ATP is an energy currency. So if you're supplementing ATP, you're going to see increases in strength and possibly muscle mass, and strength leading to muscle mass, and strength leading to more muscle mass leading to less body fat. Okay. The study was fairly transparent about the ATP utilization, the ATP supplementation. But some would argue, and I think Greg in the Better Than Steroids article was arguing, that the ATP component wasn't talked about enough, and it's almost suggesting that HMB was giving all these effects. I didn't necessarily see that, but I see where that's coming from. The bottom line is that HMB does seem to be effective over placebo or over control. Is it something that you should be taking? I think it's pretty expensive. I don't think that it's getting results that are probably better than anabolics. I think that's highly unlikely. I think there's a lot of different confounders there. I think it's safe, but I think it's relatively expensive. And I think that if you could get the same effect with leucine, maybe you should start there, taking in some leucine. The one thing, and this is very important, the one thing that has me leaning slightly towards HMB, if I were to try it out, and again, it's kind of pricey, is the fact that HMB doesn't seem to spike insulin as high as leucine. So for someone like me who does a low carb protocol and doesn't want insulin spikes a lot, and fast, I do intermittent fasting where I don't want to have insulin spikes, if HMB could be something that I could take to have sort of a downstream effect as if I was having leucine but without as big of an insulin spike, I'd be all over it. So that's the data I need to dig into more to see if it's something worthwhile for me. But I think the takeaway here is it's safe. I think it's good to try out. You might have an effect, you might not, but even if it's a placebo effect and you get something out of it, I think it's a win. So anyway, all kinds of new stuff popping up all the time, and I think there's a lot of other holes to be poked in other supplements outside of HMB, which has decent data. So that's my takeaway on it. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.